Hey, so it's Father Taylor here, and we have another great story to tell. You know that right now for our stewardship season, we are focusing on this phrase that we are stewards of God's story. So we got the big story from God, but it isn't like it's just out there. It gets played out in our own lives. And so today, it's really a joy for me to have one of the more colorful people at our church. And I say that as a compliment. Uh, Great to have you today, Sharon. How are you?
I am very well today, thank you.
Great, great. So, Sharon, let me ask you a couple of questions before we get started. I know that you're a musician and that you teach. How long have you been teaching piano?
I've been teaching piano for 46 years, so this is year number 47. I'm
Wow.
I'm considering myself semi-retired because at the height of when I taught, I had about anywhere between 23 and 27 students, and I used to have anywhere from 2 to 4 to 5 music for little people classes per week. But when I was doing that, my husband was establishing himself in his own business. So about that time, I did everything but put on a clown suit and go to birthday parties. I refused to do that. I had a master's degree. I was not going to do that.
Wow, wow. And so your husband is Larry, right?
Yes, Larry's my husband.
And how long have you guys been together? Not just married, but together.
We've been together for 50 years. He started dating me when I was a senior in high school, and I took him to my senior prom.
Wow.
He's a year and a half older than I am, but 2 grades. His sister and I, may she rest in peace, when I'd known her since I've been in her reading class since 5th grade, and we were in classes together from 7th grade on. We had a little contentious relationship because she used to put thumbtacks on my seat, and when I was in high school, she put a big bolt and said, "I lost this somewhere along the way," and I kind of spoiled her fun because I smiled and said, "Oh, thank you, I really could use this now." And her mother found out about that years later and said, "I can't believe she did that," but it didn't. And my best friend, when I started dating Larry, said, "You do realize that that's Michelle's brother?" And I said, "It's not like I'm gonna marry him. I'm just dating him." But
And
I
there you
did
have
marry
it.
him.
Hey,
I did marry him.
so as you grew up, did you grow up going to church?
Yes and no. Pre-Vatican II, before 1964, we went to church all the time. My mother was a good Catholic. She converted my father. I made I was baptized at Molesworth Air Force Base in Arrington, England. I was made my first communion at St. Joseph's Cathedral, the first thing that happened after the fire. I made my confirmation at St. Martha's. So yes, we went to church, but around Vatican II, two things happened. My mother's mother, passed away at age 64 of cancer.
Hmm.
My mother lost faith in God at that point, and we became. It's a joke. Twice a year Catholics, Christmas and Easter. And although I would still pop into church once in a while as I was a teenager, because I lived in an Irish Catholic neighborhood at that time, and we would just go to St. Martha's and just get up in Enfield. And
Let me ask you a question. So, having grown up in those earlier years, with being as a kid, First Communion, confirmation, all those things, did you I mean there was church, but did you really kind of grow and kind of an understanding of like have a relationship with the Lord in those days?
I'm not sure. I really don't think that my relationship with God maybe didn't come. I'm not sure I saw his work when I had calluses on my vocal cords when I was 17. And I really altered. I was auditioning as a voice major, but that my plans had to change. And at that point, because I was silent, that's when my husband started looking at me because my mouth was shut for a change. And I don't know if I saw it then. It was only maybe a few years afterwards that I saw that was God's work in his life, in my life, that he was there. And I always had a sense of knowing he was there. I love the little song, Jesus, my brother, kind of. I never thought about Jesus being my brother at that point. I kept thinking about God. I knew about the Trinity. I kept wondering about the Holy Spirit, but that was that was different. But there was always God, and I knew I could always trust God. I thought I knew he was there, and I knew he was looking after me. But
Okay,
it took a long time to get personal.
okay.
Oh, he was grown.
And so along the way, sometime after you and Larry got married, this is part of the story that you're going to tell on Sunday, but it has to do with the birth of your son Charles, who I think is like one of the most, I don't know, he's a great dresser. He's he's a very good dancer. He's got great social skills. I think he's quite the guy. But we're seeing Charles after what a mother goes through to help raise a child who has additional issues to deal with than just a regular child. So tell us a little bit about that, if you don't mind. I know it's a very personal part of your story, but what can you tell us about that in terms of like how God was involved with that? How did that go?
Well, when Charles was born, my husband and I were teaching eighth grade CCD, and we were involved in St. Mary's in Windsor Locks Church, and so I loved going to church. I loved being part of it. Charles was baptized at Mass, so that our whole CCD class could come and be part of it.
Just to interrupt you. So if you don't know, in the Catholic Church, and I think sometimes it has to do with the fact that some families are so big that oftentimes baptisms take place after Mass, like in an afternoon. So to have your child baptized at Mass, if it wasn't like a special day, like some Easters or the Vigil or something, that's not always the case. So, but you said you had your son, was baptized at Mass. It's kind of a big deal.
It was a very big deal. The priest insisted. Father Leclerc was just wonderful. He thought that all baptisms should be at Mass, and for a while they were, and then things changed.
Okay.
And, Charles continued to grow, and my mother always thought, oh, he's just Prince Charles and just the smartest little boy ever. And when he turned 2, and things were not, going, they didn't seem the way things should be. And he got to be 3, and just, the social skills weren't growing. When you're 2, you have parallel play. When you're 3, you begin to interact, and it was harder for him to interact. I never had to worry about him at that point talking to strangers, because if you weren't related to him, he would not speak to you. And he had a very good vocabulary, but he was just an odd child. And
so he was a child you deeply loved.
Oh yes.
And he certainly was spectacular in some ways.
And he also
so what happened when he started, like, let's say kindergarten? Like, what happened?
Well, it started in preschool. He went to preschool, and we were already, by the second year of preschool, we were already having PPTs. These are these parent-pupil teams that we would try to find the best way. And by that time, they'd send him to the school system paid for him to go to the St. Francis Schools Problem Program to try and diagnose. One of the things they didn't diagnose, though, that we found out by accident, and I know it was God, because I was teaching at a synagogue, and all they asked me is, please just don't teach any St. Valentine's Day songs or stuff like that. Oh, no problem, teach me some of yours. I like them. And one day I couldn't go. I forgot why. Something to do with Charles. And the woman told me all about her son and how he used to have these outbursts and crying and off. And it was like she described Charles to a T. And it turned out he was allergic to artificial color. And so I took away the vitamins that had color, and my husband, after a few days, do you notice Charles was a little calmer? So that's when we discovered, if it had not been for God sending me to this synagogue to meet this woman who told me her story, that I would never have thought about artificial color. And to this day, he's much better, but he has to watch out. Yellow number 5 and 6 are not his friend.
So something happened that you described to when we talked yesterday. Oh. You were talking about something that happened about the time he was 5.
When he was in kindergarten, it was probably the most depressing time of my life. There is not enough money in the world that could make me live that year again. I kept getting calls from the school. His teacher called me practically every day. The phone would ring, and I'm like, oh no, she's going to call. It was so depressing. It was just, he wasn't fitting in. I actually worried that he wouldn't learn how to read, but that turned out not to be a
I
worry.
know, but at the time, so you're like a young mom, you got a 5-year-old in kindergarten,
It was
and you're getting
awful.
these calls all the time. You had a little bit of inkling of something wasn't right. And
Nothing going,
and what
nothing.
and how did the weight of that eventually affect you?
It was, I didn't think about, I guess I couldn't allow myself to think about it, but I was totally depressed. And as was my husband. And the two of us never said to each other how depressed we were. And that's probably how we managed to get through it. And because a lot of things happened at the end of his school year, we ended up moving and a lot of things. But at that moment, that February, I think it was in February or March. It was wintertime. I was so depressed. And my mother happened to be not working at the time. So I would call her every day and moan and groan. And then I would hang up the phone and I would set the timer for 20 minutes. That for 20 minutes, I could feel sorry for myself because the rest of the day, when I would open the door to go down to my piano studio, nobody cared about my story. They just cared about, was I going to be a good piano teacher? Was I going to teach them music? And I better have a smile on my face because nobody wants a cranky piano teacher. So I would allow myself 20 minutes every day to kick the furniture. I literally kicked this gold chair. I just kept kicking it. One day I got off the phone with my mother and I'm kicking the chair. I was just, I think I was probably pretty at the end. And I probably said it out loud. Oh God, why me? Why me? Why Larry? Why Larry and me? What on earth did we do that was so bad that you gave us this child who's just not fitting in, who's not doing anything? Oh my God, what is wrong? What did we do? What, God, what? And I'm pretty sure I was probably out loud. I don't think that one
So,
was.
so let me get you to pause there. So it wasn't just that you had a kid that wasn't like, the top of the kindergarten class,
It wasn't.
but that you had a kid that had tremendous difficulties. You still hadn't gotten the diagnosis that he eventually got that were kind of made sense for that. But I'm just thinking, like, as a young mom, you're trying to teach students, your husband's trying to get his career going, you're trying to pay bills, you have like the child, and your mom is loving us, the grandchild, but there's something wrong with the child, and in his and so now your response to God is, why did you do this to me? What have I done to deserve? It sounds like that story when the disciples, who were still kind of new, and they were outside the temple and they saw a blind man, and they said to Jesus, "Tell us, Lord, who sinned to result in his blindness? Was it his fault, his sin, or his parents' sin?" It's interesting that we have, as people, we have this tendency that, like, well, something bad has happened. Maybe God has done this, and I've deserved this in some kind of way. So that's kind of like, that's not exactly like the story you hear in church, like, and then I came to realize that God had revisited all the sins in my life on my child. What a terrible thought, but that's the weight of the frustration you were going through. So exactly. Did you have, like yesterday, you told me some almost darker kind of thoughts you had?
Well, that was later on. But at that moment, kicking the chair, and I kicked it and I stopped, and it was like a light bulb. It was an epiphany. I never understood epiphany until that moment. And I had an epiphany, and I realized it was God who said to me, "I'm not punishing you." I realized then that Charles was a special gift from God, and that God could not trust this special gift to just anybody. God chose Larry and I to care for this precious little gift that was unsocial, on just everything.
I mean, did that actually, like from that moment on, was there a change in the way you saw your situation?
Yes. At that moment, I realized we weren't being punished. We were chosen. And at that moment, it changed the way I reacted, because I kept thinking, Charles has got to change. It was Charles has to change. Charles, not I had to change. And at that moment, then I realized, things began to change after that. We had like more BBTs, and we began to see a psychiatrist, and who was very wonderful and very hopeful. And and at that point, it stopped snowing. That was always a help when I'm not a good snow person. And spring came, and as spring came, we were planning to move across town, so we were changing schools, and getting off this busy street that we lived on to this little cul-de-sac that we live on now. And just a lot of things at that moment, it felt like from that was the moment that it's almost like you have a big heavy weight on you.
Yes.
And but it slowly begins to lift. And by the time we got over to this house in June, and he was going to South School, and I loved his special education teacher, which he did not have a special education teacher at the other school. And I want to underscore, his kindergarten teacher was a loving, caring person, and I would see her often afterwards. And ironically, my sister's, I think it was her son, had the same kindergarten teacher that Charles had, and Rebecca was with us the day that Charles graduated from the Jenger Center. And my sister went back to tell Mrs. Wolf, the happy ending, that there was a happy ending.
But how significant that you have like an epiphany of all things. But to have an epiphany, there has to be a sense that not only, there has to be a God that can give an epiphany.
Of course.
And this idea that like it kind of, God redefined for you your role. Like it's not like you're the victim, but your role, like, no, you're the God has allowed this, not just allowed it by accident, but this is kind of like part of the path that God's kind of chosen for you. And it does make all the trouble go away and everybody lives happily ever after, like it sort of, but it did make a significant change. Now, let me ask you a question that we haven't talked about. As you, so Charles was young then,
Five.
Then into the first grade and going through. So how do you see God at play? Like how has God been, when you look back now as a person who's come to know the Lord a little more, how do you see God in that whole process?
Well, God has a plan. He never shares it though, but he reveals it. And God's time is not our time. I'm a little impatient with him, but I'm working on it, God. And so Charles had some good year, some good years. And fourth grade was another one of those not so good years. His special ed teacher had left special ed, and the one that he had for the next 2 years, we don't like to speak of her. But
I want to just for time's sake, want to take you back to like, this is like, Charles is an adult now, and I'm looking back, and you said, well, God, God has a plan, although he doesn't tell it to you on the front end, but he seems to reveal it. And so would you say now that like, well, I certainly have seen God at work in what I thought was almost like a mistake, but now I see, no, wasn't a mistake. There's actually a God at work.
It was when Charles was having his confirmation. He was sitting up there beaming, and God said to me, "See, I told you it was going to be okay." And I said, "Yes, I know. I hear you."
Again, I'm going to interrupt you again. So people sometimes in conversation will say things like, "Well, God said I should," but is that really how God works with you? Like there's a moment sitting in a pew at the Catholic Church that you had a sense. I'm not saying that like you said, Sharon, I'm over here in the back. And I don't mean like that, but you had a sense that God was like almost without words saying, I told you this.
And he's not faithful. God is faithful because things have happened. Different things have happened. Things are not always smooth. Nobody's path is smooth. And every time something we think that is life-changing and awful happening, something really good comes out of it. Charles got fired from a job, and we thought, oh no, how are we going to do this? And he got hired at FedEx, and he's been there for 17 years, and they love him there. that was and I would get every time, and I've been in so many situations where I've been so fretful, and I've just turned to God, and he, and something will happen to reveal that I'm taking care of you. I've got this. I'm bigger than all of the things that are happening to you. Just turn to me. As Jesus says, carry my burden. My burden is you are weary. Come carry my burden is light. And that's kind of been the way it's been. He's just, God has provided. When I thought Laura and I weren't going to have food to eat, food was all. We came into the share program. Something was provided. God has never failed to provide what we need. We don't always get what we want, but God always provides what we need. And I have never felt needy, and that God
Sharon,
has.
thank you for sharing this story. I look forward to seeing how you kind of arrange it for Sunday. But what a great story to see both, not just the events about Charles, but to see how you went from I grew up in going to this church, and I got first communion, and got confirmed and stopped going. But you can see the growth. Like looking back, it's like amazing to see how God continued to develop this relationship with you to a place where you can trust that even the situation which didn't look great turns out to be part of the plan. So thanks for sharing your story, and we look forward to hearing your story on Sunday.
Thank you. We'll see you Sunday.
Okay.